Thank you all for participating for that webinar of the FRS Japan program, the first one of this year. And the subject is cybersecurity, common challenges to Europe and Japan in a post-Ukraine war context. Cybersecurity, as you all know, is a major issue for democracies, under threat from influence operations, trying to manipulate public opinion, from hacking and ransomware, as it happened recently against hospitals in France, but not only in France, everywhere, but also classic spying or theft of intellectual property. The functionality of satellites or major infrastructures can also be tampered with and can constitute an act of war. This is at least the French position, as these actions pose a direct threat to the sovereignty and security of a country and the well-being of its citizens. These attacks can take so many forms, can find so many paths of entry into systems, that the issue of deterrence, attribution, and retaliation remain a difficult one. In 2015, Japan launched a cyber initiative to promote the rule of law in cyberspace, as in all global commons like maritime or space domains. Japan also encourages CBM on cooperation and capacity building to enhance security in the cyberspace. At the same time, Japan, like France, remains vulnerable to cyber attacks, and answers are not more easy in an open society relying heavily on access to data, external exchanges, and trade for its prosperity. France, like Japan, has its own national digital security strategy. It started in 2015 under President François Hollande, and Japan has the same as a digital agency since 2021. The objective was to accelerate the lagging digitalization level of the Japanese economy and society under COVID. It was also to implement the concept of free flow of non-personal data, while at the same time put under careful protection, I quote, personal data, national security intelligence, and intellectual property protection. But I will not go further and leave the floor to our two most excellent speakers, Dr. Professor Kazuto Suzuki and Dr. Nicolas Mazzucchi. Professor Kazuto Suzuki received his PhD from Sussex European Institute, University of Sussex in England. He served as an expert in the panel of experts for Iranian Sanction Committee under the United Nations Security Council from 2013 to July 2015. And he currently serves as a member of the National Space Policy Committee of the Cabinet Office, the Government of Japan, and the President of Japan Association of Internal Security and Trade. Nicolas Mazzucchi received a PhD in economic geography and has served in various French think tanks and institutions. He is also teaching geopolitics in multiple French military academies, such as the École de Guerre or the Center for Higher Military Studies. He wrote many research papers and books, his latest being Geostrategic Alliance in the Eastern Mediterranean and MENA, which he co-wrote with T. Alexopoulos and T. Barketos. He is currently a research director at the Strategic Studies Center of the French Navy. Each of the speakers will speak for approximately 15 minutes, and then there will be a session of Q&A. And please put your question by using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and I will relay your remarks or your questions. Please, Professor Suzuki, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much, Valérie, and thank you very much for listening and participating in this very interesting seminar. My name is Kazuto Suzuki. I have been working on the science and technology and international security issues as a political scientist. So from that point of view, I am not exactly working on the cyber issue, but in my scope of research, cyber always comes down to the very important element of the issues with regard to the security which cross border. cross-border security with new technology. So let me just talk about the situation in Japan. Well, Japan is a very unique country in the sense of the cybersecurity issues. There are a variety of reasons, but one of which is that there is no single coherent agency which is responsible for the national security for the cyber issue. Although we do have the cybersecurity strategic headquarters, which is headed by the Chief Cabinet Secretariat, and which includes most of the network-related responsible ministers, including the Chief of Police and Minister for Economy, Industry and Trade, and the Minister for Internal Affairs and Communication. But this cybersecurity headquarters is basically built up for the monitoring and the emergency responses. But meanwhile, there is a new addition of the agency called the Digital Agency, which is responsible for the digitalization or the promotion of the digital transformation of the actions of the government. So the digital agency is basically responsible for all the data, and particularly the government-oriented data, but the digital agency is not responsible for the cybersecurity. On the other hand, the cybersecurity's responsibility mainly falls to the police office. But the police office, under the police office, there is some interagency operation center called the NISC, the NISC, and this NISC is supposed to be responsible for protection of the national system. However, this NISC is also being not mandated by law that these are responsible for protection of the individual network. So the individual network or individual servers are responsible for the owners and operators of those servers. And in this way, that there are a number of recent attack on the critical infrastructure in Japan, which is the recent major one was the attack on the hospital in Osaka, which has destroyed which was a ransom attack, and the data of the patients are entirely isolated from the network, so that the hospital cannot operate for the last 2 months. There are some successes of the cybersecurity, particularly in times of the Tokyo Olympics in 2021. The Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics were considered to be the primary target for the cyber attack, and there was a heavy investment of the protection of the systems for the Olympics and Olympics-related cloud services. And it was a sort of an all-star game of the security-related people, including the Ministry of Defense and the self-defense forces. The Olympics was the successful case, but it only proves that the Japanese cyber defense can only be available and effective only when it protects a point or just a single event. it doesn't really prove that the Japanese cybersecurity is protected entirely. And one of the major issue because of that is the reason behind the lack of the comprehensive and holistic approach is the legal constitutional issue. The constitutional Article 21 guarantees the protection of the private communications, and this Article 21 of the Constitution prohibits the cyber network operators and the cyber the cybersecurity responsibles not to be able to monitor the entire traffic, so that it will have the sort of a mass data, the big data, but it will not be able to identify which servers the attacks comes from until the attack really appears to be an attack. So we cannot take a preemptive measures because of this constitutional framework. Also, there are a number of other legal means, including the law to establish the network operators, and these are also being hindering the effort to actively engage into the monitoring and preventing the cyber attack. So there is a discussion of the forward defense or active defense in the cybersecurity realm. And this is now being discussed in the framework of the revision of the national security strategy. The national security strategy, together with the guidelines for the national defense program and the national defense program. So there are 3 papers which will be revised and will be published by the end of this year, so in 1 month's time. And there is it is not yet disclosed, so we cannot be sure, but there are a lot of discussion about how to promote the cyber defense in the context of the national security strategy. And in the national security strategy, there is a possibility that the mandate for the self-defense force, which is only responsible for protecting its own network and own system, but not for the entire national system, will be transformed to will be given more wider mandate to protect the critical infrastructure and as a part of the national defense strategy. Also, there are a number of issues discussed in the context of cybersecurity, and active defense is one of the contested issue. However, because of the constitutional constraints, the active cyber defense is being very controversial, and it is yet to be seen that this will be included as the part of the national strategy. Furthermore, I think in the general data policy term, what Japan is trying to promote is what is called the DFFD, the data free flow with trust. And this was publicly launched idea in 2019 Osaka G20 summit. And this idea is to make a coherent strategy for including the United States, Europe, and India to form a sort of a free flow area of the data, because of in order to compete and contrast with the Chinese cybersecurity and the data policy. Since the data flow in China and is exceptionally high because of the lack of regulation in China, so that the big data is being used in the for the various applications in China, particularly for developing AI technology. But so there are certain cases that Japan has been competing against the developers of the AI technology in China and trying to expand the possibilities by connecting the data flow between the United States, EU, and India. But in order to ensure the DFFT, it is necessary to have the more secured cybersecurity network and system. And in fact, the lack of the cyber defense mechanism in Japan, then it is considered that this will be very difficult for the other states to support and participate in the DFFT. Finally, I like to make some comments on the general outline of the Japan's cybersecurity strategy, which was initially published in 2015 and revised in 2018. These are basically focusing on the objective of the cybersecurity and the and principles of the cybersecurity strategy. There are 5 principles of the cybersecurity. One is the free flow of the information, and the second is the rule of law. Third is the openness. Fourth is the autonomy, and fifth is the collaboration with the different entities. So again, the second principle comes as a rule of law, which makes it difficult for Japan to overcome this constitutional constraints at this moment. So what we need to do in the future is to revise the interpretation of the Constitution, particularly the Article 21, and how to implement the cybersecurity strategy. And in this cybersecurity strategy, the objective of the security is to take the first step instead of reactive. So it's to be active rather than the reactive, and there is a certain understanding that cybersecurity is not just the cybersecurity alone, but it has a wider implications, so that to protect the cyberspace is the active way of protecting its infrastructure and the network with other countries. So these are the cybersecurity strategy in Japan. But again, as you may see it, it is relatively vague, and because of the constitutional constraints, the Japan's cybersecurity is still in struggle, and I hope that it will be cleared up to a certain extent in the national security strategy, but we are just crossing fingers and see what's going to happen. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A lot of food for thought and questions with your presentation. And now the floor is to Nicolas Mazzucchi. Please, Nicolas.
Yeah. Many thanks, Valérie and Professor Suzuki, for these very interesting insights about Japan. Well, for the French perspective, I think that the most interesting is to look a little bit at what's happening and what happened in Ukraine in the context of this war and this invasion from Russia. And what's surprising, or in my perspective, not surprising, is that when you're looking at what happened in the cyber domain, well, finally, there were a lot of cyber attacks. More than 1,000 cyber attacks have been recorded for the moment, but their impact was very low. And when you look at the situation of what happened in Ukraine in 2015, 2016, for example, with these very important cyber attacks on the critical energy infrastructure, with the what is now a very well-known malware called Black Energy, it was slightly different this year in 2022, and to see that these cyber attacks were having very few impacts, first of all, on the physical and logical layers. The only cyber attack that is very notable, it's what happened at the eve of the invasion on the 24th of February, the cyber attack against the space system by the society Viasat that it was targeting the KSAT satellite network. That had a direct impact on several industrial elements in Ukraine, but also in Europe, and especially in Germany, having a direct impact on the management of wind turbines and wind farms. And also to complement what Professor Suzuki said, it's also highlighting the very intertwined nature of cyberspace as a warfare domain. This complementarity between space, cyber, and also having this impact. But well, aside this cyber attack on the Viasat society, which was also a cyber attack targeting the value chain of the society. Apparently, when we are looking at the public release of the Viasat society, the cyber attack at first targeting a vulnerability in the VPN system and not in the directly in the modem to connect to the satellite network. So also highlighting what is very well known, this cyber attack through value chain. But well, again, very few successes from Russia. When we are looking this time not on the technical layers of cyberspace and cyber attacks, but at the informational layer, well, we had really the same issue, is that there were a very large number of attempts from Russia, but very few effects. Also, a very well-known example is the attempt to create a deepfake video of President Zelensky asking for Ukrainian troops to surrender to Russians. But this deepfake was so badly made that it was a total failure. It was only broadcasting through Telegram channels that were pro-Russian. And so it had no direct effect on the Ukrainian forces or the Ukrainian population. So Russia, that was before this war considered a major cyber power, demonstrated its total failure in the cyber context. So was Russia overrated? Maybe, but in my opinion, the most important point in this situation is not to look at Russia and the Russian capabilities, but to look at Ukraine and what happened between this era when Ukraine was suffering heavily from the cyber attacks, so 2014, 2015, 2016, and present day 2022. What happened during this time was a very important effort in terms of policy. First of all, Ukraine released its cyber strategy in 2016, especially pointing at Russia as being the most important or the supposed most important provider of cyber attacks against Ukraine, highlighting the need for cooperation between armed forces, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, the whole administration, and civil society, and also insisting on the need for Ukraine to act on both the technical layers and the informational layers. Also, in the meantime, between 2014 and 2022, there was also a very important element of international cooperation between both Ukraine, the EU, and NATO, and also member states of NATO or EU, especially the US and the UK. For example, in June 2021 was signed a cyber agreement between the European Union and Ukraine for assistance to Ukraine in case of major cyber attack. This agreement was used in June 2022 to dispatch the EU cyber rapid response team to Ukraine to protect the Ukrainian critical infrastructure against cyber attack. But also it's highlighting that the efforts made from the Ukrainian administration, government, and globally the population with the support of major cyber powers that are within the EU or within NATO was very successful, because it created both a strong cybersecurity environment in the country with a large number of investments in training and in technical capabilities, first of all, and also regarding the informational layer. What was very important was to create, but considering what happened in 2014, I don't think it was that's important to create this, but to create an awareness situation of what can happen in terms of disinformation, in terms of fake news. And when looking at this deepfake of President Zelensky in mid-March, and a total failure of this deepfake, putting aside the technical issues regarding this deepfake, it was also very important to understand that this awareness and this training for the population and the civil society was also, in my opinion, the major point for the success of the Ukrainian forces, considering the cyber domain. So when looking at Europe, it's very interesting because it's the way Europe engaged for now largely more than 10 years. So strengthening awareness, strengthening cooperation, investing in the protection of major critical infrastructure, with, of course, differences between the member states, some considering that cyber security, cyber protection has to be given to the military and the ministries of defense, or other countries, as France, for example, considering that the whole cybersecurity of the administration and the critical infrastructure operator has to be given not to a military system, but to a civilian one, with the creation of the National Agency for Cybersecurity that is directly under the Prime Minister in France and coordinating the whole interagency and interdepartment work to protect this critical infrastructure. So, well, the lessons learned from Ukraine are very important, also in highlighting this need to also engage more in cooperation, because it's ever the issue with the value chain. The chain is as strong as its weakest link. So we need to continue to invest, we need to continue to develop our capabilities. For example, when looking at France, France is updating regularly its regulation regarding cybersecurity, but also regarding cyber defense. For example, last year in 2021 was published the last part of the cyber defense strategy of France, which is the cyber influence doctrine, after the cyber defensive doctrine and the cyber offensive doctrines a few years before. Well, regarding the EU and regarding France, what is very interesting, putting aside these issues of the war in Ukraine and regular updates in cyber defense, is that 2022 was a very interesting year in terms of European cooperation regarding data and regarding the private sector, because in this year we had two major EU regulations, namely the Digital Market Act and the Digital Services Act, that were designed to improve the EU policy regarding privacy and security of data. Both of them are more or less targeting the major data providers and keepers, considered in this text being gatekeepers, so being having a dominant position over data collection and data use, especially the US-based GAFAM, but not only. We can also think at the Chinese BATX that could be considered regarding the definition of what a gatekeeper is in the Digital Market Act, for example, that could be considered as these gatekeepers. And the EU regulation there regarding the Digital Markets Act is creating, or is not really creating, because this regulation already exists in non-digital business sectors, but is transposing the idea of some kind of third-party access for the systems of this gatekeeper, and to force these gatekeepers to not only promote their own systems, their own applications, but to keep the door open to let the other companies, or the could be European or foreign ones, to access their systems and to propose the European population to have a real competition, and not what could be considered a closed system when you're buying an Apple phone or a Google-based phone. You're not now forced to use only their software. So this idea of having an ex-ante regulation to force these gatekeepers to open the systems is also working with the Digital Services Act, that is also targeting specifically these actors, but broadly speaking, more the social networks than the marketplaces, and to ask them and to create for them obligations to be more assertive in enforcing the regulations of Europe and the European member states towards the fight against fake news and the fight against illicit contents. So this was the major European Union activity regarding the regulation of cyberspace this year, in order, after working for years in strengthening the cybersecurity, strengthening the cooperation between member states, nowadays to create some kind of, let's say, European area where the competition rules of the European Union are also well enforced regarding foreign actors, and especially the US-based actors, but not only. I could say that it's another brick in the wall regarding the privacy of EU citizens after the GDPR. That was the first brick in the wall. So this complementarity between these two regulations, European Digital Markets Act and European Digital Services Act, is now creating, let's say, the whole global architecture in order to promote this European area where privacy and where control over personal data has to be ensured by the citizens. The last brick of this year is also this agreement between the European Union and the United States that has not been that much discussed for the moment. It was an agreement that was signed during summer and translated a few weeks ago into a US executive order by President Biden, in order to recreate a new agreement on data privacy after the failures of Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield that were considered by the Court of Justice of the European Union not being enough to protect the privacy and to protect the rights for the European citizen regarding their data when these data are stored in the United States. Now the US are also being more open towards the European regulations, towards the application of GDPR, and also probably Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. And also what was very important is to underline that the US agreed to open a little bit their system of data collection for national security. That was the major point that was considered by European Court of Justice of being not protective enough for the European citizen, is that when you're looking at the US regulations regarding data collection and intelligence, and especially the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Amendments Act of 2008, that is allowing the US intelligence agency and national security entities to collect any kind of data all over the world, as long as the US national security could be considered endangered. Nowadays, this new US-EU data privacy agreement is creating a framework where the EU citizens and globally the European Union is asking, and probably I hope that we'll have an access to a more transparent system regarding the US data intelligence collection, where the US data intelligence agencies have to explain their need for collecting the data of European citizens and the use of this data. It's translating more or less the systems that is used towards the US citizens, which is the Patriot Act, to the EU citizens, which is creating a stronger use for the GDPR regarding the collection of data and the storage of data in the United States. So this year, 2022, was very important, not from, in my perspective, not really from a cyber defense and a war in Ukraine perspective, because it was only the confirmation that when you're working enough on investment, technical training and awareness, it's working and it's protecting you. But really, it was more interesting with this very important action from the European Union in order to strengthen privacy and what Professor Suzuki mentioned, the free flow of data in the EU, and also the free flow of data out of the EU to create this common space of data sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for that very extremely complete presentation. Now, for now, I have no comment or questions to the panelists, so please do not hesitate to put your comments or questions by pushing the Q&A button, and I will relay them. But meanwhile, I have a question for jumping from what, Nicolas, you just said. One of the things you said concerning the importance of the fight against fake news and illicit content. I would like to know if Japan has been specifically or increasingly the target of influence operations, either from China or from Russia or from any other actors, by the way, in recent years. If there is a relation with the war in Ukraine, or if maybe it's not such a factor for Japan as it is for Europe. And also concerning illicit content, and the definition of illicit content maybe is not the same in the EU or EU countries or in Japan. And what measures is Japan taking against first these influence operation, and then what to do with illicit content? Thank you very much, Kazuto-san, if Suzuki-san, if you want to answer this question.
Right, thank you very much. I think these are very important points, and I haven't really touched upon. So, yes, there are lots of issues with regard to the fake news, and there are a number of cases that that has been taken as the criminal act, as if the individuals are involved in the fake news. But the definition of fake news is quite narrow and limited. If there is an actual damages to the economic or social reputation or things like that, then it will be sued as the criminal case for creating the sort of fake and fraud information. And there is no specific legal framework to punish or to control the fake news in general. In terms of the influence operation, there are a number of cases that explicitly mentioning about the Chinese, Chinese operators were clearly marked their footsteps and providing some sort of a propaganda operations, but there is a very limited, at least it is there is unknown cases a lot, but there are very few cases which is apparent that that are the influence operations. However, there were a number of cases in Japan after the war in Ukraine broke out in February. There are a certain amount of the network traffic, particularly in the social media, to support the Russian position. And those are perhaps some of them are done by the agents from Russia. However, what is interesting is that these influence operations, or these sort of discourses that is protecting the Russian position and blaming the NATO's expansion and the U.S. involvement in the process of Ukrainian democratization. There are a number of experts working on the Russian issues, and those who are have a very strong credentials. There are a number of defense experts who intervened in those discussions and fight for the those discourses which are taking the certain sides of the certain they're supporting the Russian position. So in that framework, it was a very interesting case in Japan that it wasn't the national authority which are trying to control over the flow of information, but it was the private and the collective action of the experts, which was very effective in terms of correcting these influence operation, if there's any. And furthermore, in terms of the illicit contents, there is no clear definition of illicit contents because of the freedom of speech. So basically, it is Japan has, to a large extent, lagging behind of this discussion about what is the illicit content, and we haven't really exposed to the influence operations, as in case of 2016 presidential election in the United States. So we haven't really built up the national consensus on what is illicit content, so that most of the cases, these are protected under the freedom of speech, and these illicit contents are not being on the table of the discussion. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. Nicolas, do you have a remark to make regarding these points? But I think it's quite interesting to have maybe the French side of this.
Exactly. Thanks, Valérie. We're facing exactly the same issue, because in terms of illicit content, it's very difficult, to define what is exactly an illicit content in terms of disinformation. It's very easy when the information is strictly conceived as a false information from the start, but having a disinformation campaign that is using a basic information that could be conceived not really as being false, but being distorted. The issue is the malign intent. And the most important thing is now for the police forces and for the Ministry of Justice, to highlight and to bring evidence of the malign intent of peoples in order to create major disorder, in order to undermine the cohesion of the society, in order to provoke demonstrations of hate, etc. Plus, there is also the very specific issue, but it's an illicit content, but it's not related to disinformation, but it's included in the Digital Services Act. That is the child pornography, which is also a very specific case. But looking at this disinformation issue, I think that all democracies are facing the same challenge, is to enforce this fight against illicit content and against disinformation and what is undermining the society, but in the same time to protect the absolute freedom of speech. And it will be a very narrow path and very tricky issue regarding especially this regulation of the gatekeepers and the social media. For example, the French administration is very worried about what's happening with Twitter these days, because not having a regulation that is strong enough regarding the social media can, open the Pandora's box to any kind of disinformation.
Thank you very much. And I still do not have any remarks or questions, so we will go on with our. You have a comment to make?
Yeah, I was interested in Nicolas' comment on the Twitter, and I heard that the European Union is trying to shut down the Twitter headquarters in Brussels or in EU. How does it possible, or will it have any impact on the company's operation, and also will it have any impact on the the social media network? I mean, I assume that Twitter is also having the building up some sort of a forum for the free exchange of information. So what's your take on this sort of a rumors?
Thanks for your question. Well, I don't know. I don't think that the European Union is having the legal power, to take this kind of decision. It will be only the Belgian government that can have this kind of decision in forcing Twitter to leave Brussels. But it's a very specific problem, because the European Union with the GDPR tried to create some kind of extraterritorial legislation, but the European Union is not the United States. In the United States, it's very easy to have this extraterritorial legislation and to have it enforced. When you're in the European Union, you have to rely on the goodwill of the different actors. And with the majority of social media, if you take Facebook, for example, they are cooperating for years with the European Union. And with Twitter, it's very specific because Elon Musk is appearing as a person that is not willing to have its will imposed by any organization, being the United States government or being the European Union. So it's very worrying for the European Union, and it may also underline the limits of possibility for the European Unions, because when you're looking at the Digital Services Act, of course, the European Union can impose fines, and very important fines, over the gatekeepers and over the social media that are having policies and that having operations that could appear to be opposed to this legislation. But aside from fines, nothing is possible, because, as you mentioned, Twitter is a US-based company, is a global social network, and unless Twitter becomes a provider of disinformation, and if tomorrow it becomes provider of disinformation, the European Union could have a direct operation as the EU countries and the European Union had towards the Russian state-sponsored media, Sputnik, Novosti, etc. But unless this case appear, there will be very few possibilities to act against Twitter, aside from fines, of course.
Thank you. I have a question, very interesting one, and from Sidonie Robert, and it's a question to both of you. What areas of the EU-Japan digital cooperation need or should be reinforced in the coming years, according to both of you? Professor Suzuki, if you want to give first your take on what kind of EU-Japan digital cooperation, what form it could take, and what is needed, actually.
Well, I think there are a number of areas where Japan and the EU can cooperate. First of all, I think the war in Ukraine has given a lot of lessons. Although it's according to Nicolas, I mean, this is a confirmation of what has been successful. But I think these experiences are important lessons for Japan to learn in terms of the actual build up for the cybersecurity capabilities. The second point is, I think together Japan and the EU can build up a much stronger case for the protection of the personal rights. I think the GDPR is the much closer model for the Japanese the spirit of constitution for protection of the personal information. And although we are in the sort of a different position at this moment, but the GDPR can be actually work together with the concept of the constitution. If we compare to the other models, like a Chinese model where the states lead and state controlled everything about the data, and the United States where the corporation controls the data. So I think the European model is perhaps the most suitable case for Japan to learn, and perhaps I think it can be possible that Japan and the EU can work together to let's say develop some sort of a normative base of the concept of the given the right to the people for protecting and controlling and ownership of the data. So these are the 2 points that I can think of, but I'll let Nicolas to think furthermore.
Nicolas, your take on this?
Many thanks. Yeah, I totally agree. Just to add, in my personal opinion, 2 points that could be complementary. The first of all is that there is this very important, of course, opportunity of bilateral cooperation between the US and the EU, and Japan, and also a multilateral cooperation, that is this cooperation between the EU and Japan within the context of the Indo-Pacific, and to promote also in this cyber domain the free and open Indo-Pacific, and to propose also a common model for all the countries of the region. I think it's also very important. As you may know, the EU released in 2021 its strategy towards the Indo-Pacific. So it's not only France, but the whole EU is also very engaged towards this area as Japanese, and it will be a very important, I think, area of cooperation. And the second one is also not a geographical area of cooperation, but a sectorial one, is in the maritime domain. Sorry, I'm speaking for my own business, because I am from the Navy. But Japan is a major maritime power. The European Union is also having a major maritime domain, and I think that the development of knowledge and the sharing of data, sharing of practices in collecting, storing data for the awareness and for the knowledge of the maritime domain, in terms of digitalization of the maritime domain, but also in terms of knowledge of the maritime domain, for example, in the fight against climate change in the oceans, could be a very important also area of cooperation between the EU and Japan.
Thank you.
Valérie, can I just add a few more? I think I'm inspired by the Nicolas' comment. Yes, I think, yeah, I fully agree that the EU strategy towards free and open Indo-Pacific is very welcome. But just to remind you that Japan and the EU has the strategic partnership agreement, EU-Japan SPA. And cyber security is part of the SPA. So I think there is a lot of we already have an institutional basis to work together on the cybersecurity strategy. And adding to what you mentioned about the maritime cooperation, I think there is another domain that we'll be able to cooperate, is the space. cyber attack on space. I mean, you mentioned about the Biosat. This is the case that the real threat to the space assets on the cyber attack is well, you know, and it is extremely important to acknowledge that this attack was just the day before the invasion. So it is reasonable to assume that if there is any military conflict, then there'll be a more active attacks on the satellite network to reduce the capabilities. You know, the satellite is a critical infrastructure for the military operation. So I think the attack on the on satellite and the space infrastructure will be the sort of will be expected in case of the conflict. So I think the information sharing and you know, developing the protection of these critical infrastructure, and there are many things that will be able to work together. And you know, since I'm working as a member of the National Space Policy Committee, and I am responsible for the space security, so I think this is an extremely important area of the EU-Japan cooperation, you know, in terms of the securing the cyber attack on satellites.
Thank you. We only have a few. Sorry, there is a new question, so I will find it. Yes, and another questions, and it's do you see the digital partnership as a way to reinforce the implementation of the maritime side of the EU-Japan strategic partnership in the Indo-Pacific? I think Suzuki-san, you already answered that question, and also on space, it's extremely important. Do you have to add something on this, or?
So the digital partnership is a way to reinforce. Yes, I do agree that this is a very important. I mean, France is a residential power in the Indo-Pacific. You have the overseas tom-tom territories in the Indo-Pacific, and I think it is important to share the maritime information, not only because of the to promote the digital partnership, but also to strengthen the coalition of the fight against the disruption of the international order in this region, particularly the extension of the maritime forces of China. So I think this is extremely important to have the monitoring capabilities, not just the climate issues, but also we need to have the we need to build up the information and information sharing framework on the illicit movement in the maritime domain in the Indo-Pacific. And also we need to think about seriously about protecting or the monitoring the attacks on the submarine cables. The submarine cables are the vulnerable infrastructure, and there are a number of cases that that has been witnessed that the critical infrastructure, particularly around the Taiwan Straits, the submarine cables are physically attacked in some cases, and these are also very important issue. This is not exactly a digital issue, but it's a physical protection of the infrastructure.
Thank you very much. So thank you for your participation and presentation to both of you, and for all the participants who listened to your presentations. This webinar will be published on podcast by FRS. So once again, thank you for being here this morning or tonight for us in Tokyo. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.